Most people think invalidation is obvious. It's not. It rarely shows up as open rejection. It's subtle, it's quiet, and that's why it's so dangerous. It sounds like logic. It sounds like advice. It sounds like you're overthinking, or it's not that serious, or you always take things the wrong way. On the surface, it looks harmless. But underneath, it sends a very clear signal. What you feel is not accurate, and therefore it doesn't matter. Now, here's what most people don't understand. An empath doesn't just hear words. They track emotional consistency. They notice tone shifts, timing, the gap between what's said and what's meant. So when invalidation becomes a pattern, even in small doses, it doesn't go unnoticed. It gets logged. The first time it happens, they question themselves. The second time, they adjust. The third time, they start observing you instead of engaging with you. And that's the shift. Because once an empath moves from expression to observation, the connection is already weakening. They're no longer trying to be understood. They're trying to understand why they're not being understood. Invalidation creates internal conflict. Not because they're confused, but because they're trying to reconcile what they feel with how you respond. And when those two things don't align over time, they stop sharing. You won't see a dramatic reaction. You won't get a confrontation. What you'll notice is silence where there used to be openness, shorter responses, less emotional investment. They start giving you a filtered version of themselves. That's not distance by accident. That's distance by design. And here's where it becomes irreversible. The moment an empath realizes that expressing their truth leads to dismissal, they reclassify the relationship. You're no longer a safe space. You're a controlled environment. And in controlled environments, they limit exposure. They stop bringing you their thoughts. They stop showing vulnerability. They stop expecting understanding. Not because they don't care, but because they've measured the outcome and it's consistent. This isn't emotional weakness. This is pattern recognition. And once that pattern is clear, they don't need closure. They don't need a final conversation. They don't need to explain what you did wrong. They simply reduce access until there's nothing left to access. So if you consistently make someone feel like their inner reality is wrong, exaggerated, or inconvenient, don't expect them to fight for the connection. Because the moment they feel unseen long enough, they stop trying to be seen, and that's when they disappear. Most people think emotional chaos is just part of personality. It's not. Pattern. And patterns have consequences. It shows up in inconsistency. One moment, everything is calm. The next moment, there's tension with no clear cause. The tone shifts. The energy changes. And there's no explanation that matches the intensity of the reaction. To the average person, it's confusing. To an empath, it's exhausting. Because an empath doesn't just experience emotions. They absorb environments. They walk into a room and immediately start mapping it. Who's tense? Who's holding something back? Where the pressure is. And without saying a word, they begin adjusting themselves to stabilize it. That's automatic. It's not a choice. It's how they're wired. Now place that person inside constant unpredictability, sudden frustration, passive-aggressive comments, silent treatment followed by forced normalcy, reactions that don't match situations. Over time, this creates a loop and the empath tries to solve it. At first, they lean in, they ask questions, they try to understand what's wrong. They adjust their behavior to avoid triggering the next shift. They become more careful, more aware, more precise. But here's the problem. Chaos doesn't respond to precision. No matter how accurately they read the situation, the outcome stays unstable. And that's when something changes. They stop trying to fix it, not immediately, gradually. You'll see less engagement, fewer attempts to smooth things over. They start conserving energy instead of investing it because they've recognized something most people miss. The environment isn't unpredictable by accident. It's consistent in its inconsistencies, and that's a pattern. Once an empath identifies that pattern, they don't confront it emotionally. They step back strategically. They begin to detach from the fluctuations. What used to affect them deeply now gets a neutral response. Not because it doesn't matter, but because reacting feeds the cycle. This is where people get it wrong. They interpret that calmness as acceptance. It's not. It's evaluation. The empath is measuring how often the chaos repeats, how much energy it costs, and whether there's any sign of stability. And when the answer becomes clear that nothing changes, they make a decision. Because for them, peace isn't optional. It's necessary. And constant emotional instability is the fastest way to remove that peace. So they don't argue, they don't demand change, they don't create a scene. They simply start creating distance. Less time, less conversation, less presence until one day the chaos is still there. But they're not, because when someone realizes that being around you means constantly managing unpredictability, they don't try to control it forever. They remove themselves from it. Most people don't notice imbalance right away. It builds slowly. It hides inside normal interactions. A favor here, a conversation there, a moment of support when it's needed. On the surface, everything looks fine. But underneath, there's a quiet calculation happening because giving for an empath is natural. It's not forced. They listen longer. They notice more. They show up when it matters. They offer time, attention, emotional presence, not because they're asked to, but because they can feel when it's needed. And at the beginning, they don't expect anything back. That's where the misunderstanding starts. People assume that because an empath gives freely, they don't keep track, that it's effortless, endless, and unconditional. But that's not how it works. They may not count in numbers, but they measure in patterns. They notice who checks in on them. They notice who listens when they speak. They notice who shows up when they're the one who needs support. And when those moments are missing consistently, it doesn't create immediate conflict. It creates awareness. At first, they compensate. They give a little more. They try to balance it quietly. Maybe the other person is busy. Maybe they're dealing with something. Maybe it's temporary. So they continue investing, hoping the energy will eventually meet them halfway. But when it doesn't, something shifts. The giving becomes intentional instead of natural. They pause before responding. They hesitate before offering help, not out of resentment, but out of recognition, because one-sided dynamics don't just drain time. They drain identity. When someone is always the listener, always the supporter, always the one holding space, they slowly disappear inside the role. And an empath will tolerate that for a while, but not forever. The turning point isn't loud, precise. It's the moment they realize that their presence is expected, but not valued, that their effort is used, but not acknowledged, that the connection only functions when they are the ones sustaining it. And once that realization becomes clear, they stop feeding the imbalance. You won't see anger. You won't hear complaints. What you'll see is reduction, shorter replies, delayed responses, less availability. They start matching the level of effort they receive, not to prove a point, but to confirm a pattern. And when the pattern stays the same, even after they pull back, the conclusion becomes unavoidable. There is no mutual investment here. That's when detachment becomes permanent, because an empath doesn't need equal effort in every moment, but they do need evidence that the connection exists in both directions. And when all they see is one-way energy, they don't argue for balance. They become the balance. By removing what they were giving, trust doesn't usually break in one moment. It erodes quietly, gradually. And most of the time, it's not because of something big. It's because of something small that keeps repeating. It starts with inconsistency, promise that sounds solid in the moment, but never fully materializes. A statement that doesn't quite match the action that follows. A detail that shifts slightly each time it's told. On their own, these things look insignificant, easy to overlook, easy to excuse, but an empath doesn't process them individually. They connect them. Because they're not just listening to what you say, they're tracking alignment. They notice when your tone doesn't match your words, when your behavior doesn't match your intention, when your story doesn't match itself over time, and when those mismatches appear once, it raises a question. When they appear repeatedly, it creates a pattern. At first, they give you the benefit of the doubt. They assume positive intent. They look for explanations that make things make sense. Maybe you forgot. Maybe it was unintentional. Maybe there's something they don't see yet, so they stay. They observe. They wait. But here's what most people don't realize. Trust for an empath isn't built on what you say. It's built on predictability, on consistency, on the quiet confidence that what you present on the surface is the same thing that exists underneath. When that consistency breaks, even slightly but repeatedly, it creates a gap. And that gap is where doubt starts to live, not loud doubt, not confrontational doubt, just awareness. They begin to listen more carefully. They pay closer attention to details. They compare what's said today with what was said yesterday. They watch how often intention turns into action and how often it doesn't. This isn't suspicion, it's calibration. Because once they sense that something doesn't align, they don't react emotionally, they collect data. And over time, that data leads to a conclusion. It's not about whether you lied once. It's about whether your behavior can be trusted to stay consistent, whether your words have weight, whether your presence feels stable. When the answer becomes no, the connection changes immediately. They stop relying on you. They stop sharing openly. They stop expecting follow through. And without expectation, there's no foundation left to build on. This is where people think trust can be repaired with explanations. It can't, not in this state, because the issue isn't a single moment. It's a repeated pattern that has already been confirmed. And once that pattern is confirmed, they don't argue about it. They adjust to it. Less belief, less openness, less access, until eventually there's nothing left to question. Because when someone shows you consistently that their words and actions don't align, you don't need to confront them to understand the truth. You just stop treating them like someone you can trust. And that's when they quietly disappear. Boundaries are rarely the first move. They come later, after observation, after adjustment, after multiple attempts to to maintain balance without needing to say anything directly. So when an empath finally sets a boundary, it's not casual, it's calculated. It might sound simple. I don't like that. I need space. I can't do that anymore. The words are clear, but what sits behind them is a long sequence of data points. Moments where something felt off, times where a line was crossed, instances where their comfort was traded for peace. And here's what most people misunderstand. A boundary is not a request. It's a line that marks the limit of tolerance. It's the point where adaptation ends. When that line is ignored, tested, or pushed even slightly, it doesn't just register as disrespect. It confirms something deeper. It confirms that their internal limits are not being taken seriously. At first, they might repeat it, not louder, not more emotional, just clearer. They'll restate the boundary in a different way, give context, make it easier to understand, not because they're unsure, but because they're giving space for correction. But if the response is the same dismissal, pressure, or subtle attempts to bypass it, the process changes. They stop explaining. Because explaining only works when the other person is willing to respect the limit. When that willingness isn't there, more words don't create more understanding. They just create more exposure, and exposure without respect leads to withdrawal. This is where the shift becomes visible. They begin to reduce interaction in the areas where the boundary was crossed. They become less available, less responsive, more selective with what they share and when they engage. Not as a reaction, but as a recalibration. Because for an empath, boundaries are tied directly to safety, not physical safety, but emotional clarity. The ability to exist in a space without constantly defending their limits. And when that clarity is disrupted repeatedly, the environment becomes unstable. No one stays in instability forever. So they make a decision. Quietly, without needing agreement, they stop placing themselves in situations where the boundary will be tested again. They change how often they show up, how much access they allow, how much of themselves they bring into the interaction, and eventually the distance becomes permanent. What looks like sudden disappearance is actually the final stage of a long process. A process that started the moment the first boundary was crossed and confirmed every time it was ignored after that. Because when someone shows you that your limits are optional to them, you don't negotiate those limits. You remove yourself from the place where they keep getting crossed. Safety is not something most people think about directly. It's assumed. It's expected to be there without needing to define it. But for an empath, safety is the foundation of everything. Not physical safety, emotional safety. The ability to exist without filtering, without calculating every word, without preparing for a negative reaction. And the moment that safety starts to disappear, everything else begins to change. It doesn't happen all at once. It starts with small signals, a judgmental comment when they open up, a subtle shift in tone when they express something real, a reaction that feels disproportionate to what was shared. On the surface, these moments seem minor. But to someone who is constantly reading emotional feedback, they carry weight. Because each of these moments answers a question, is it safe to be real here? At first, they test it. They share something small, something low risk. They watch how it's received. If the response feels supportive, they open a little more. If it feels critical, dismissive, or unpredictable, they pull back slightly. This is calibration. They are adjusting how much of themselves they reveal based on the environment they're in, not to manipulate, but to protect. Now, when the pattern becomes clear, when authenticity is met with judgment, when vulnerability is met with discomfort, when honesty is met with subtle punishment, the calibration stops. And it turns into containment. They begin to hold things in, not because they don't have anything to say, but because they've learned that saying it comes with a cost. So they minimize, they simplify, they present a version of themselves that is less likely to trigger a negative response. What you see is still them, but it's reduced, less depth, less emotion, less presence. And over time, that reduction creates distance because connection only exists where authenticity is allowed. When someone can't be themselves fully, the relationship becomes a performance. And performance requires energy. An empath will perform for a while if they believe it serves a purpose, if it maintains peace, if it avoids conflict, if it protects something they value. Once they realize that the performance is replacing the connection, not supporting it, they stop, not dramatically, not with confrontation. They simply stop investing in a space where they cannot exist as they are. And here's the part most people miss. They don't leave because they're hurt. Okay? They leave because the environment has been clearly defined. It's not safe to be real here. And when that conclusion is reached, there's nothing left to negotiate. No conversation that needs to happen. No explanation that needs to be given because the absence of safety removes the purpose of staying. So they withdraw their authenticity, then their presence, and finally their access until there's nothing left of them in your world. Because when someone realizes they have to become someone else just to remain connected, they don't fight to keep that connection. They choose themselves and they disappear.